Good evening, and welcome to today's webinar, Beyond the Culture Wars, Teaching Constitutional Principles in Polarized Times. I'm Monica Harris, Executive Director of Fair for All, and I'm delighted to host this very important conversation on Constitution Day. Today marks the anniversary of one of humanity's most remarkable achievements, a document that has guided our nation for nearly 240 years. Yet, recent data reveals a troubling reality. Constitutional literacy among American students has reached historic lows. Incredibly, many students can't name basic rights or identify fundamental governmental structures. Now, this isn't just an academic problem. This is a crisis that threatens the very foundation of our democratic republic. But here's what makes this particularly challenging. In our current polarized environment, even teaching basic constitutional principles can feel politically charged. Many educators find themselves walking on eggshells, avoiding essential civic topics to prevent controversy. The unintended consequence, of course, is that we're now creating a generation of civically illiterate citizens. Tonight's webinar launches a new series highlighting the educational environment that has necessitated and inspired FAIR's American Experience curriculum. Our curriculum is a balanced approach that teaches constitutional principles as shared American heritage, not as political ammunition. Tonight, we'll explore the challenges that educators face in teaching constitutional literacy, how we can reclaim constitutional education, how teachers can establish classroom norms that prioritize principles over politics, and most importantly, how we can help students understand the Constitution as a process for resolving disagreements rather than a predetermined set of answers. So I'm thrilled to introduce Liz Evans, who brings over 2 decades of hands-on experience in civic education. Liz has taught across the social sciences and public school settings, working with both middle and high school students. She holds a BS in elementary education and an MED in secondary history from Northern Arizona University. And she's currently pursuing her doctorate in educational leadership, something that's very important right now. As a nationally board-certified social studies and history teacher and certified project management professional, Liz understands both the classroom realities teachers face and the systemic challenges in education itself. She's worked with the Bill of Rights Institute as a program manager and now serves as program director of civic education and outreach at Arizona State University. Our second guest is Dr. Adam Seagrave, Associate Professor of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Adam is also the co-founder and co-director of the Race and American Story Project. I should also add that he is a primary contributor of original lesson content in FAIR's American Experience curriculum, drawing from his deep expertise in civic thought and American political foundations. Adam's work focuses on how we can teach the complexity of American history and our constitutional principles in ways that bring students together rather than divide them. Adam's scholarly approach to these sensitive topics makes him uniquely qualified to address the challenges that we're going to be discussing tonight. So both Liz and Adam understand that effective constitutional education requires more than just knowledge. It requires wisdom about how to navigate these now sensitive topics in politically charged environments while simultaneously maintaining academic integrity. So Liz, Adam, thank you both for being here tonight. And Liz, I think I'd like to turn to you first, with our first question. And it's about just addressing the context and the scope of the constitutional literacy crisis. Can you share with us what data there is that tells us right now that we have a constitutional literacy crisis among today's students? What are you seeing in terms of their ability to identify basic rights or even understand fundamental governmental structures?
Absolutely. And thank you, Monica, for having me. That is really the right place to begin, right? Because the data is sobering. So we have formal, really, and informal data. National assessments like the NAEP civics exam consistently show that fewer than 1/4 of students reach proficiency. And in some years, that number has been down in the teens. So when I work with teachers in professional development or when I visit classrooms, I can kind of see that reality playing out because students can't name the three branches of government, identify basic rights in the Bill of Rights, or explain concepts like checks and balances. And what worries me the most is this doesn't exist in a vacuum. Today, students live in an environment that's saturated with social media, where constitutional language gets kind of tossed around freely. So terms like free speech, Second Amendment rights, separation of church and state, but without being able to ground that in the actual text and structure of the Constitution, a lot of times these phrases can be misunderstood, misused, and misinformation can spread really quickly. And students absorb these competing narratives online. And without the tools to evaluate them against constitutional framework, things just kind of get lost in the mix.
Yeah, I definitely see that happening just informally. When I've seen TikTok videos, I think we mentioned, Adam, were we talking about a recent, I don't know if it was a survey, if it was just a man on the street interview, where I think young people under the age of 25 couldn't even identify all members of the Supreme Court and even thought one of them was a
Judge
celebrity.
Judy. Yeah, yeah. So that's a statistic I love to cite. It's a fun one. So it was actually a 2015 survey, so it's a little old now, but in 2015, 10% of college graduates and 13% of the general public thought that Judge Judy was a member of the Supreme Court. And I think actually we can probably all agree that constitutional literacy has gotten worse probably since 2015, at least overall in terms of the test scores. So if that was the case in 2015, it's probably even worse now. But that's a fun one to cite in terms of how ignorant much of the American public is about our constitutional structures and our form of government and who even our officials, elected and appointed officials are.
Yeah, very sobering. Um, and Adam, while I have you, let's just continue with the second question. How do you think political polarization has made teaching our founding principles seem partisan when they're actually nonpartisan and, quite honestly, foundational to our system? I guess the question would be, what's the difference between teaching constitutional principles versus teaching political positions? The two can often get confused these days.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good point. They do get confused, and it's to the detriment of civic education that they do. Constitutional principles, I think it's important to keep them separate from current political policy debates and debates about political positions, because political positions are about what happened yesterday and what we should do tomorrow and what's going on at the moment, which are important issues to talk about. But constitutional principles are timeless truths. They represent timeless truths, permanent commitments that we have may have made with each other as citizens and as community members in the United States. And so those constitutional principles should underlie all of our conversations and discussions about policies in some way and inform them. They should form a sort of common ground that we can all share, a touchstone that we can go back to, framework within which we can debate policy positions. So it is really a problem when those very constitutional principles, the structure and form of our government, the reasons why we have the government design that we have, when those things are themselves used as political footballs and contested as political positions or are made into partisan, weaponized for partisan purposes, that's a really dangerous thing because if we lose that commitment, that shared commitment to the Constitution and to the principles that underlie our system of government, then political discourse breaks down and we have the polarized situation we're in today. And so that's something that I think, yeah, students have really suffered from that because they often aren't given the knowledge and the tools and the dispositions needed to distinguish between constitutional commitments and political positions.
Yeah. Liz, do you have anything to add to that?
I do want to add to that because when we talk about this, we really don't want to paint the issue as teachers, right? Teachers are doing the best they can with what they have. And, Adam talked about 2015 to now. I mean, even being a teacher in a classroom, things were changing so fast. And the influx of social media and how, quick kids could get things and then they would repeat it. And it was things like, I can say whatever I want. I have the freedom of speech. And it's like, but we've gone over these principles and these things. And so it's hard for teachers to, because I don't think teachers are as chronically online as our students are. And so there is this kind of gap in thinking, and teachers are trying to catch up and communities are trying to catch up with this. So, and I know Adam would agree with this, is when we're talking about students not getting the things they need, we in no way are blaming the teachers here, because the teachers are doing the best they can with what they have, which is why we all do the work we do to ensure that teachers have as much as they need to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's right. Just to add to that, the teachers haven't been getting the support that they should be getting from administration, from legislation, from a education policy standpoint. So the fault is not with individual teachers. The fault is with the lack of support that they're getting and incentives to teach civics.
So I think I'd like to turn now to a topic that goes directly to FAIR's American Experience curriculum, which was designed largely to address the political polarization and social polarization that we're seeing now. So I want to just get down to sort of real world experiences. And Liz, I know you've worked directly with the teachers across the country. Can you tell us how the culture wars have weaponized constitutional concepts and what impact you see this having in classroom instruction? If you have specific examples of how this plays out, I think our viewers would really love to hear them.
Yeah. So, Adam kind of touched on this already, and that's a really powerful and difficult question, because culture wars have taken what Adam said should be uniting us, free speech, due process, religious liberty, and turn them into weapons of partisan identity, right? I think sometimes we forget that political does not necessarily have to mean ideological. And instead of being these shared constitutional principles, they become this litmus test of what side you're on and who you voted for and whatever else. So in my dissertation research, I've heard teachers describe this pressure very vividly. They want to lean into teaching, into inquiry, into using collaboration and reflection so that students can wrestle with these constitutional questions. And it's not just things are right or wrong. It is they're digging into primary sources and they're doing this. But when constitutional concepts are politicized in the larger culture, those strategies feel risky to teachers. I had a teacher tell me that even mentioning the 14th Amendment in relation to immigration triggers complaints from parents. And it's another explained, there's a Supreme Court case, Island Trees versus Pico, about book banning. And if even just talking about a Supreme Court case that has, two sides are arguing in front of it is seen as pushing an agenda. And again, even though it's a Supreme Court case, it ties directly into their curriculum. So the weaponization impacts not only what gets taught, but how it gets taught. And teachers are reporting self-censoring, they're avoiding certain amendments, sanitizing classroom discussions, steering away from these because they don't feel protected, again, like Adam said, by their schools and their community. And this means that our students are losing out on opportunities to see the Constitution as a living framework for resolving disagreements. Instead, they encounter these sound bites from social media that are completely stripped of nuance and history. And that is, we're risking this generation of students who know the words of the Constitution, but don't know the meaning of the Constitution.
I'm listening to this and I'm fascinated by the fact that the 14th Amendment, which is the sort of the core of equal protection, how that's being weaponized. Can you just sort of drill down a little bit more and explain why why it triggers parents when discussing immigration?
Well, and I'd like to give a little bit of context here, because we're in Arizona, we're in a border state, right? And the utilization of talking about a natural born citizen, this is where it almost is like parents want to get into a disagreement with the teacher about what it means. Like, people can't come here and have what they call anchor babies, and you shouldn't be teaching about this, even though, again, like when the three of us could sit and talk about, what's a natural born citizen and what did that mean, and really going back to the founding and talking about these. But it's almost as if parents as well, as community members, hear these certain words that just trigger, you're pushing an agenda, you're doing something else, instead of, again, I think when you really understand the Constitution, for me, if somebody is like talking to my daughter in her social studies class about the 14th Amendment and what that means, specifically birthright citizenship, to me, that's a normal thing because it's the text of the Constitution and talking about what it means. So, I know in different parts of the country that's going to be seen, some people might not see it as controversial at all, but because I think we are in a border state, that, I mean, our state used to be Mexico a really long time ago. So things like that. And I think that parents come from it from a very genuinely good place, because they read things online. They're not trying to be combative. I think there's a lot of fear because they don't, I brought up a lot of Gen Xers like myself or millennials didn't receive a civic education. So when their students are receiving it, they're thinking, well, I didn't get this, in schooling. So what is this? What does this look like? So I think there's just this really big gap that creates fear of talking about it, and learning about it.
I mean, just what you've shared, I think it reminds all of us that this problem goes much deeper than the K through 12 education.
Yeah.
It seems like this is part of an ongoing trend that's been happening for decades, just, a continued deterioration of constitutional literacy that has now brought us to this point. I don't know we know how we can start to address it with a curriculum like theirs at the K through 12 level, but how in the world are we going to reach the adults out there who are never going to go back to school, who will probably won't open up a book about the 14th Amendment or any part of the Constitution? How do we reach them?
So I will say one of the really cool projects I'm working on right now is something called Civics in a Year. It started this July 4th and it's going to next July 4th. It is 250 podcast episodes. And it is specifically, when I was looking at this, I received the project from our director and I was looking at this and kind of creating user stories in my head. And one of the user stories I utilized was my dad. My dad is in his late 60s. He is from rural Iowa. He asked me a lot of questions, and he's been asking me a lot of questions since I've been teaching because he did not receive, that kind of civic education. And so when we were creating these podcasts are 10 to 20 minutes a piece. They all have a question tied to a curriculum, right? And it is for people who are like, I wonder what this means, because I think as adults, sometimes it's hard to say, hey, I don't understand what this means, because we're not used to being learners. And so the hope is little things like this, or when students are using our curriculum or your curriculum, they're talking with their parents about it and getting them engaged. I don't think it's a lost cause. I think we just need to make it accessible and, for lack of a better word, friendly, right? I have no problem as a learner going into Adam's office and being like, hey, I have this question. I really don't understand it. Can you help me out? But it's because I've been trained to do that. And I know if I go into Adam's office, he's not going to make me feel bad. He's going to be like, oh my gosh, yes, and pull a bunch of books from the bookshelf. So I think that living in a world that is so, we talk about culture wars, and when you ask questions, you're afraid that you're going to be labeled as this or that, is inviting people to say, I didn't really learn that. I wonder where I can get that information.
Mhm.
Again, we are nonpartisan, just like you. Our job is to get people civically literate. And for a really long time, we were in the K-12, but we've kind of adapted that to user stories like my dad, who maybe people want to learn about this. And 250 sounds like a lot, but not everybody has the same amount of gaps. So we want to make sure that anything like that is accessible. And I know that we are not the only ones doing the work. We are in this incredible civic space where so many people are doing the work. So the hope is if it's accessible, if it is friendly, if it engages the learner instead of making them feel like bad because they never learned it, that's going to be a more inviting way to learn civics.
Yeah, I
Adam, do
think
you have anything to add to that? Okay.
yeah, that's such an important project, Liz. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. I think it's really admirable, and I think you're right. It's not hopeless when it comes to adults. I think a lot of it is dispositional. I think that came out in your description and talking about it, that the disposition to learn is so important, and the disposition to learn is directly counter to the disposition to confront and demonize and dehumanize and oppose someone because of their political positions, right? We see too much of that today in our political discourse. And so the disposition to learn is something that is just going to directly counteract that and hopefully lead to positive development in the culture more broadly. And that's part of why I think classrooms are sort of the ground zero for changing the culture in this way, because that's what people are there to do in the classroom, is to learn, right? That's what students are there to do. And ideally, that's what teachers are there to do as well, right? To learn from each other and from their students. So I think that's a really good point. I think also, of course, our current era, the digital age and the age of social media, it really has exacerbated a problem that people always have, which is that we're very presentist, right? So we always are thinking directly in terms of our narrow slice of time and what's of concern to us in the moment. And that is what lends itself to politicizing everything that we talk about, including the Constitution. So I think one of the real contributions of civic education in general and the American experience curriculum in particular is that it gives historical perspective, right? It helps people to see our current moment in light of our history, our shared history in this country. And so I think that's a really crucial contribution that these curricula can make.
Thank you. I'm gonna do something different and jump to audience questions, viewer questions now. And the first one we have, I think it really touches on the distinction between a democracy and a republic, but I'll let you guys speak to that. The question is, by teaching only constitutional provisions, does that mean it is forbidden to note that it is undemocratic, that the state of Delaware should have 2 senators, while states with significantly greater populations also have only 2 senators? Interesting.
So
Which
I jump in on that first, Adam, because I actually just recorded a podcast episode on that today. I think that my first question, because as a teacher, I tried to use the Socratic method, right? I'm trying to ask more questions to really understand. And it's the Ted Lasso quote, be curious, not judgmental. The 2 senators from every state is actually from the Articles of Confederation. And it kind of goes backwards. Like we could start doing kind of a backwards design, right? Like, okay, Senate has 2. Articles of Confederation had that. Like, where did we get that? And then talking about how did the founders kind of not counteract, but I mean, counteract that with the House of Representatives. And I think looking at, I'm sure Adam's going to say the same thing, primary sources. Primary sources are a civic teacher's best friend, because sometimes you just want to say, I wonder why, and where can we find these, and how can we really start to dig in? And I think the really important thing as a teacher is to tell kids, you're going to ask questions that I'm not going to have the answers to, because I don't know everything, but I know how to find the answers. And I know that especially when I taught AP government, during the 2016 election, my biggest thing for them was, when you have a question for me, when you come in, I want you to ask the question, but I also want you guys to know where to find the answer. The answer is not me. I am not the sage on the stage. The answer is in the Constitution. It's in the Federalist Papers. Maybe it's a precedent of another president. And, talking about that, Lois, if you were in my classroom, I would ask you, why do you think that's undemocratic? Like, where are we getting this? And again, starting a conversation, and I'm not judging, I'm asking a question, because I know that there are definitely anti-federalist papers that think that, or federalist papers that are like, we shouldn't be doing that. That's the great thing about the formation of our country, is that they didn't all sit down and go, yeah, that looks great, let's do that. There is a lot of conversation back and forth.
Yeah. Liz, your point about primary sources, that's just an excellent point. I think that's really, really important. And I think you're right. When you go back and look at the primary sources and delve into the reasons for some of these constitutional provisions, it's enlightening, right? And it's different than you might think based on contemporary discussions. And this question about are we a democracy or a republic? It's a fun one. Of course, it's longstanding, and we all talk about it a lot. It's fun to talk about. But again, when we go back to the primary sources, and as Liz said, the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, when you look at those documents and how those people were thinking about these concepts, they really weren't opposed in the way that we tend to think of them today. And I think that's actually a good example of how sometimes we do transform constitutional discussions into political discussions. We think that it's different to be Democratic versus Republican, and part of that's because that's our party system, right? We have Democrats, we have Republicans, and we attach to those ideas. And so then we read that opposition back into the founding era, when as a matter of fact, I think the founders, they spoke of being a democracy and being a republic differently, but in related ways and in ways that aren't opposed the way we think of them today. So I think it's a bit anachronistic when people call the Constitution undemocratic, or when they say it's a republic, not a democracy. Certainly, the founders thought of our constitutional system as a republic, but they also thought of it as a democratic republic in many ways. And so I think that it's going back to the primary sources, though, I think is always the right answer. So that was a great point.
Thank you. Liz, going back to the 14th Amendment and immigration anecdote you shared at the top of this webinar, um, when students bring up current Supreme Court decisions like Dobbs and many other landmark decisions that have become very polarizing, decisions they've heard about in the news, and they may not have actually done a deep dive into, how do you guide, or how should teachers guide the discussion back to the foundational constitutional principles and keep them from erupting into political reactions? And how do we keep? And it's difficult because a lot of these decisions, let's be honest, the Supreme Court, it's composed of men and women. They're humans. They are politicized. They are political animals, despite their best attempts to appear anything other than political animals. But they are appointed by presidents for political purposes, if we're being honest. So how do you, and everyone knows this, even students, how do you balance that with, the attempt to remind students that, hey, this should all be about our constitutional principles, not politics? It's difficult. I'm just wondering how you recommend we do it.
So in my AP classroom, when I taught AP government, Roe versus Wade was one of our required Supreme Court documents. It is no longer, because it's no longer the law of the land. But I wanted to say that for this example. My students could talk about abortion case law without it being an opinion thing, because we were looking at case law. And so I would always start with something very easy to access, not political, like something boring, right? And ask them, what is the question the Supreme Court is looking at? How is each side arguing this, right? How are they arguing these constitutional principles? And you build up to that. And it is never a perfect system, right? Because I think as human beings, having an emotional reaction to something we do not like is a very natural thing. But I always would tell my students, we are political scientists today, right? Leave your feelings at the door, bring in your case law. We're thinking like lawyers. We're looking at documents. We're looking at court precedents. We're looking at, things. So we would look at, going back to birthright citizenship, right? We'd look at, as a Kim Wan arc, it's there in my head somewhere, but look at what has the Supreme Court said. And one of the very first lessons I do is the Supreme Court hasn't always gotten it right. And let's look at some examples. And again, we are looking at it from a lens of presentism, right? We are putting our values from 2025 all the way back, but let's look at some of these and really teaching them how to dig into what have former courts said, what have laws said. And I really want to kind of harken back to teacher professional development. The reason that I could teach abortion case law so well is because I went to a summer institute and I got to go to the Supreme Court and I got to learn from people in Georgetown law and I got to be with my peers and talk about what could this look like in my classroom. And that to me was worth more than any graduate class I've taken. And it's one of the reasons I enjoy working where I work is because when I interact with the professors, right? And I know that Adam has taught some of these classes are taught in that manner. And let's dig in, let's look at this. And that to me is such a powerful tool to give a teacher, because if a teacher can, if you're in a class and, Dobbs comes down and kids are upset, we can say there is a time and a place. Unfortunately, the classroom is not it, but let's talk about what this means constitutionally, right? Because I'm going to be honest, the kids I had, 5 or 6 years ago are probably not surprised by the Dobbs case because they've read so much abortion case law that they understood where things were going. And so for them, they might disagree with the decision personally, but they understand constitutionally, why these justices said this, why these justices said this. And they also know if they disagree with it, what they can do, right? Spewing hatred online about Supreme Court justices isn't going to change anything. They know that it has to become an amendment, has to, the legislature has to do something. So I really think that the person in the classroom, investing in them to be able to do these kinds of things can be incredibly powerful, because you can have conversations in a classroom that are really grounded in primary sources, in the Constitution, in Supreme Court decisions, and it be nonpartisan. It's going to be political because politics is a thing, but it's not going to be ideological. I'm not pushing one side or the other. We're looking at it as a whole.
Okay. This is a comment from the one of our viewers. It's not necessarily a question, so I'm going to frame it as a question. I'm assuming I understand what they mean. So, Adam, you might be best positioned to answer this. One of the most challenging topics that teachers face is explaining how slavery existed in a country with a revolutionary constitution that proclaims all men are equal. How do we help students understand this contradiction without either excusing the founders or dismissing the constitutional framework entirely? Because maybe another way to say this is, how do we help students evaluate whether these compromises were necessary for union formation or they're moral failures that totally undermine and rob the Constitution of its, of credibility of its principles? That makes sense.
Yeah, I think obviously it's a really important point and a very, very important question that's impossible to answer in any kind of simple way. I think that so that certainly that has been part of the politicization of the Constitution, especially in recent years, but throughout our history, is its association in various ways with the institution of slavery. And I think there are a couple of points here. First of all, there's the debate about the extent to which the Constitution itself is tainted by the institution of slavery, and or the extent to which slavery and participation in that institution was a moral failing of the people who contributed to the Constitution, certain people who contributed to it, certain authors of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. I'm thinking particularly of someone like Thomas Jefferson, thinking of the Declaration of Independence, who held people in slavery. So how do we reconcile those things? I mean, I don't think that we need to reconcile them per se. I think what needs to happen is to have a nuanced understanding of what we're looking at. So on the one hand, you have ideas versus individuals, right? Versus people. People like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, those were human beings who were not perfect by any means. And not only were not perfect, but were engaged in very, very unjust, evil practices by holding people in slavery. At the same time, the ideas they had were shared by others who were not people engaged in slavery. So I'm thinking of Prince Hall's petition to the Massachusetts legislature, Prince Hall, a free African American in Massachusetts, who petitioned the Massachusetts legislature in 1777 to abolish slavery on the basis of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. So the ideas in the Declaration of Independence, they themselves were not complicit in slavery, although Thomas Jefferson as a person was. And I think we can say something similar with respect to the Constitution. Some of the authors of the Constitution were slaveholders, some were not. Some defended slavery, some opposed it very openly. And the final document itself certainly protects slavery in some ways, but also undermines slavery in other ways. And that's a conversation and debate that's been going on throughout our history in the antebellum period, and then, of course, in the time since. So I think it's a very complicated question, and I think it's not one with an easy answer. So I think any attempt to dismiss our founding wholesale or dismiss founding documents because of the existence of the institution of slavery, I think is misguided. I also, of course, think it's misguided to downplay the evils of slavery because the Constitution is an important document. I think that's wrong as well. So I think it's important to take a nuanced approach, and to separate out to the extent we can ideas, valuable ideas, and important, valuable documents versus flawed individuals who were involved in the making of those documents.
Yeah. Liz, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I think that is perfect. I think, talking about it in a classroom is having those conversations and talking about why compromise was necessary. That doesn't mean it was right. I think compromise sometimes is made to be this flowery word of like, everybody gets what they want. Compromise means you don't get everything that you want. And again, digging into primary sources and looking at it as we understand today, right? Slavery is inherently wrong. It is a bad thing. Let's look at documents. Let's look at, and this goes, it goes with the Civil War too. And it goes, there's so much in history, right? We can't just say, well, slavery ended with the 13th Amendment and move on, because we clearly can see that it's not. But again, having them investigate and be detectives and maybe asking the question, why is this in the Constitution? Are there letters that the founders wrote? What are we looking at here? Why did they make the decision they made? And again, we're not saying this person is good or bad, because humans are inherently flawed.
Yes.
Let's look at these decisions and why they made the decisions, because those decisions, again, set a precedent for things going on in the future. And I hate to say this, but unfortunately, teaching that in a classroom right now is being weaponized. And it's a hard thing for a teacher. But again, if you are grounding it in the Constitution and you are grounding it in primary sources and investigating it, I don't see that as political. I see that as being a historian and being a political scientist and being an educator.
Oh, God, I love that. I love that. It's sort of, and it brings me to the next question. I'm trying to figure out how to frame this, but all right. So we're seeing so much polarization today, but what I think people often forget, and I just wrote about this in Fair's newsletter, is that polarization isn't unprecedented in our country. From the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, America is no stranger to extreme disagreement. And many people may not realize this, but this history of disagreement goes back to our country's creation. The founders themselves bickered about and had extreme disagreements about from slavery to just the way the branches of government would function, to the electoral college. But in a pluralistic society, I think it's important to keep in mind that we don't always agree, and we don't always have to agree. We just need to disagree, without shooting each other, obviously, without, just respectfully. So, and Liz, since this question is probably best put to you, how do you help students understand that the founders weren't a monolithic group, even though they were all white men, that they had deep disagreements about slavery and other issues at this country's founding, what primary sources would be most effective for you to show students and apparently adults to demonstrate or to illustrate this complexity and history of disagreement that's inherent in a pluralistic society?
I think because I've been so in this world with the podcast, honestly, the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, I think that, one of my favorite things, when the Broadway show Hamilton comes out, right, my students were all of a sudden so engaged with it. And it was so fun. And there's some Federalist papers that we suppose who wrote them, right? And they got really into like investigating it, right? Because Madison's more of a teacher, but Hamilton starts to get like almost meaner and meaner because he's getting so frustrated. And it's important. So in 2016, with Clinton and Trump, that kids were like, this is so bad, blah, blah. I'm like, let's talk about the election of 1800. Let's talk about some of the mean things they wrote about each other and making it, and I don't want to say lighthearted, but like, no, this has been happening for a while. Like there is some serious beef. I mean, even I don't remember who the person was that was beat to death on the Senate floor, right? Like you just don't hear about these things because there wasn't social media at the time. Again, you can see things, it's quicker. And this is something that the founders didn't always get right either, right? The way they disagreed with each other, we don't want to set them up as this perfect model of civil discourse because it wasn't. There was some really not great things said. But again, showing students that throughout our history, this has been happening. The way it has been happening is different because, then you have the advent of radio and of, TV, and then it just the internet and social media. And I think that showing them that there is no such thing as perfect. We're never going to say this founding was perfect, this country is perfect, but that's one of the great things about it is it continues to be more perfect. That's what we're striving for. And so I always love the Federalist papers because it is kind of a back and forth and talking with the students about firing off a tweet or commenting on somebody's TikTok it doesn't take much brain power. But these men and women, because there were a lot of women in the founding, took time and sat down and wrote to each other and, had these really deep conversations. I think shows them it's the slowing down of it and the thinking about it. And that as a model of civil discourse, I think is an eye opener for them, right? Because again, none of our students, K-12 students, have lived in a world without social media. And they've seen the back and forth of politicians in general. But showing them that didn't used to be like that. And I really do appreciate too, because I'm an Arizonan, showing them some of the congressional records of Senator John McCain, right? John McCain, like there was that group, John McCain, Joe Biden, who would disagree with each other, but then they'd go out afterwards. My favorite was to show a clip from Parks and Rec with Orrin Hatch and Cory Booker. And they were talking about how they were in a band together called Across the Aisle, but it was like the island. And just their engagement with each other was so sweet. And they're two very different people. I think that sometimes students need to see in a world where they understand it, that it existed, but also in those primary sources of the back and forth. And disagreements have existed forever. It's just the way they have existed has shifted and changed.
Yeah, Adam, it seemed like you might want to jump in on this. Do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think Liz did a great job of explaining that because that's absolutely right. I mean, examples of extreme political polarization abound throughout our history, particularly in the pre-Civil War era, but also, yeah, the early founding era. But then also examples of people successfully discourse, talking with each other, engaging in discourse with each other across those disagreements. That abounds as well. I think the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debates are great examples. The Lincoln Douglas debates, of course, are also a good example of that. And the letters, the exchanges of letters, as Liz mentioned, I mean, in the early Republic era and in the founding era, that's really illuminating. And it's an illuminating contrast to the way that we tend to exchange ideas digitally today. And maybe a less thoughtful way sometimes than people used to exchange ideas in letters. But I think that's right. I mean, again, historical perspective is important, right? It's not new to have political polarization, but there are resources we can draw from in our history as examples to look at and try to model our own engagement after today.
Sorry. Thank you, Adam. We have a question from one of our viewers. I'm going to maybe rephrase it just a little. So the essence of the question is, how do you teach students the difference between, one, constitutional disagreement, and two, constitutional rejection? In other words, how do you distinguish between people who disagree about what the Constitution means, for example, the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship, versus people who want to abandon the constitutional principles altogether? And that latter point is important, I think, because over the last decade, I have seen personally, and I'm sure you probably have as well, a sort of growing movement. It's a nascent movement in higher ed, asserting that the Constitution is anachronistic. It's outlived its usefulness. It's time to just jettison it. I'm sure you've heard about this, and hopefully this is not something that's going to gain traction. But so yeah, the question is, how do we distinguish between people who respectfully disagree about constitutional interpretation versus the ones who say, well, if it's not clear and if it's flawed in any way, just junk the whole thing? I'm not sure which one of you, maybe both of you want to take it, but who wants to jump in first?
Uh,
Liz, I see.
I'll jump in first, I guess, this time if you want.
Sure.
Yeah, so I mean that's another very interesting point. Uh, so I think the first point is the Constitution is certainly not perfect, right? And I think that it's important for defenders of the Constitution to acknowledge that it's not perfect. It didn't come from God directly to the United States, right? It came out of a lot of compromise, as Liz mentioned earlier, among people who themselves were flawed, who disagreed about important things. The Constitution is not perfect, but at the same time, I think that the Constitution reflects fundamental commitments that are important for people to hold in the United States. And I'm thinking particularly of commitments that are articulated in the Declaration of Independence, that all human beings are created equal, possess inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think those commitments informed the system of government that the Constitution establishes. And so I think it's important that we share some of those fundamental commitments and that we try to recognize and uphold the ways that those are reflected in our constitutional system. The fact that we have a limited government with checks and balances, the federal system, all of these things designed to protect individual rights, to channel democratic deliberation. So I think it's important to share those fundamental commitments. Also, the Constitution begins with the three words that I think are perhaps the most important words in the Constitution: we the people. And I think that what that expresses is the idea that whatever else we may disagree on, it's important for us as a people, as a political community, to agree on the Constitution really unanimously. You know, initially it was adopted in a certain way by majority rule, state by state. But I think ideally the Constitution is a unanimous touchstone for all of us. And so I understand the point that the Constitution is flawed. Maybe we could imagine something better. At the time, many people thought they couldn't imagine anything better. But I do think it's a very dangerous thing to assume that we could come up with something better that everyone could sign on to, and that we the people would continue to exist if we didn't have the Constitution. So, yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah. Liz, anything to add?
I think too, especially trying to model this in a classroom, it's important for teachers to model humility, fairness, respect. Like, I don't know everything. And I think sometimes the biggest issue with disagreements is that people hear something and they stop listening and they start thinking about their response instead of wondering, like, why is it that you want to, like, I want to know more about why you think that. And I think it's a lost art because I think it's human nature for us to want to respond immediately instead of, thinking about it and asking more probing questions to understand. Because I think that, the movement that you're talking about, I think sometimes people do things like that because they don't feel heard. And so they move to these extremist positions because they want to feel heard. If a kid asked me that in a classroom, I would bring up the Thomas Jefferson quote of the Tree of Liberty, like every 19 years, and talk about that. And I, I think that the Constitution gives us a shared civic language, right? And that is an important thing. And I think that in a conversation with somebody, I would ask, what would the shared civic language be then? Because we have this, America is so different. Everybody's so different. States are different. People are different. But the thing that's not different is when you say the words free speech, people in America know what that is. When you say separation of powers, they might disagree, right, on what it is and to the extent. But I think that my first question would always be, what would the shared language what would our shared civic language be if we didn't have a constitution?
Mm-hmm. Good point. It's, listening to what you were saying about the tendency to shut off our minds when we hear something we disagree with, instead of listening deeply and trying to understand where the other person's coming from, what their perspective is. I'm just wondering to what extent that might be influenced by the fact that we have incredibly abbreviated attention spans now, and people have really lost the ability to track more than one thought at a time, or memories are even getting more. It's weird. Maybe this is just something I'm noticing, but I do wonder, even with my son who's only 16, it seems that his attention span is just, well, his memory is it's not what mine was when I was a kid. Just put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe devices may have something to do with this. I'm not sure what's causing it. All right. So jumping to a question, let's just see if we can do two questions from viewers to wrap this up. This one is literally from on the ground. This is great. The biggest problem I face is honestly behavioral. Short attention spans, what was I saying? And lack of student interest with content. I work with middle school and elementary students. How do I get students to care? Liz, why don't you take that? Oh, you have a lot to say.
I am laughing because I worked with middle school students for 13 years, which is why my hair is gray. And even my seniors, honestly, sometimes it was meeting them where they were at. I really struggled when cell phones became a bigger thing in a classroom because I did not grow up with that. I was not in that same place with them. I actually had my seniors show me how to use Twitter when it first became a, because I was like, why do I need this? And the question I would always get, especially from my middle schoolers, is who cares? Why does this matter? I'm not going to need to know this. And so I would find ways that they need to know this, right? An example, and I'm going to use this example. This was like the crown jewel of my teaching. So I want everybody to know that this was not every day in my classroom. I had an eighth grade class who, we were talking about civil rights. We're going to read Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And we were reading the whole thing because I'm like, you can read the whole thing. I'm going to teach you how to read these documents. And I had one kid that was like, this is so stupid. Why do I need to know this? There's no problems with civil rights anymore, blah, blah. And just let him do his thing. And the more we read and talked about it, he goes, oh my gosh, I saw this quote online, but the way they used it wasn't what Dr. King meant. And I was like, how many times do you think that you see things on the internet that are taken out of context? How many times do you do it as a person? And so it became a joke of the reason that you learn this is so that you're not that person on social media who's using things out of context. And it wasn't perfect every day. Man, middle school is hard. Middle school is hard. 13 years of it, and it never got easier because that age is just hard. They don't think that things relate to them, and trying to find any little way that something can relate to their lives now, right? When we talk about free speech, There was the Snapchat, like Supreme Court case a long time ago where the girl wrote something awful about her coach, her cheer team, and the school got involved. So then it became, again, it just becomes these conversations. And the more you can include them and talk with them instead of talking at them, which is hard. It is a hard thing to do, but including them in their learning and being more of a facilitator than a lecturer or whatever else, again, not an easy thing to do. I think that's where we just need to start getting these little glimmers from them. And you're not going to get every kid. And that is, I hate to say it, but that's the reality. When you have 180 students in a year, you're not going to get every kid. But if those kids know that you care about America, about the Constitution, about getting them to learn this, and you care about them, again, just finding these little glimmers is so important.
Yeah. Just add to that briefly. There also, it's worth thinking about different kinds of primary sources that might engage younger students more effectively at times than texts. I mean, I think texts obviously are foundational and important as primary sources, but there are pictures and paintings and music and maps and things like that that might be more visually engaging to students and help become an entry point into a historical period or event. And there is a resource that I'm involved with developing, just to mention. It's called the Digital Atlas, and it's produced by Teaching American History. So I direct the Teaching American History programs as well. And it's tahdigitalatlas.org has some visually engaging resources that are designed for classroom use, and I think would be useful in middle school and possibly some elementary school context. But yeah, just being creative about different kinds of primary sources, I think can be helpful at times as well. But again, I've never taught middle school and elementary school students, so Liz's insight is more valuable.
I think too, one of the things, because I think now there is a growing concern with people not loving their country. And I would always explain this to my students. I am an Iowa Hawkeye fan, football, basketball, all of it. When I watch these games, I love this team. 45 years of fandom. When I watch this team, I do not sit there and say everything is great. They're doing so awesome. I'm a couch quarterback. I am yelling because I want them to be the best that they can be. And so criticism of my team is not saying that I don't love them. It's not saying they don't have this fandom. And I think that one of the things with our country is people will say, well, if you disagree, you're not a patriot. You are, because if you go back to the founding, if you go back to the 20th century, people love our country and they want it to be better. They want this ideal that's in the preamble, this more perfect thing. And I think that showing students the more you know and the more you can push for this country to be even better, that is what being an American can be. It doesn't have to be the only thing, but that is a really important part of being a citizen. And as a student, even if you can't vote as a 13-year-old, what you say and do does matter. And starting to do this early is important, because then when you're, 17, 18, things like that, it becomes better and better as you go.
Yeah, totally agree. We're at the top of the hour, guys, and I've gotten through like half the questions I wanted to ask you. I can't believe how quickly this hour is gone. I would just ask viewers, if you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and you would like to see a part two, just drop a note in the chat. Let Gavin know, because I'm sure our guests would be more than happy to come back if there's interest.
Absolutely.
Liz and Adam, I want to thank you both for this incredibly insightful and thoughtful discussion. What strikes me most is that my takeaway is, it's not constitutional literacy isn't about avoiding difficult topics. This is about approaching them with the proper framework and tools, which, for understanding our Constitution. And so again, thank you guys so much. And thank you also to the attendees who, for your commitment to civic education, for understanding and appreciating how important this work is, this education of not just our young people, but our older, our adults as well. The future of our democracy hinges on the work that teachers are doing in classrooms right now all across America. So it's imperative that we support them. As a reminder, I have to make this pitch. Tonight's webinar is the first in a series of webinars highlighting the educational challenges that inspired our American Experience curriculum and celebrating America's semi-quincentennial, say that 3 times fast, birthday. And that is the campaign that FAIR will kick off later this month. Our curriculum addresses exactly these issues, the providing educators with the tools to teach America's very complex story, including constitutional principles, in a way that unites us rather than divides us. And if you're interested in learning more about FAIR's approach to constitutional education, civics, and civil discourse within our broader American Experience curriculum, please visit www.fairforall.org. I also want to remind everyone that FAIR exists entirely on goodwill. We're able to operate solely based on donations from curious and interested people like all of you attending tonight. We do our very best to offer programming and educational information that helps bring awareness and attention and solutions to what we feel are the most timely and relevant issues facing us. So we hope that if you enjoyed the content tonight, you'll consider donating to FAIR and joining our movement to help us keep doing the work that you all value. And the links are in the chat. Gavin's going to drop it if he hasn't already. Or you can visit www.fairforall.org to make your contribution. And very lastly, I'm excited to share that FAIR is launching its Educators Alliance Group. I should say relaunching, because it was in effect a few years ago, and then it took a pause, and now we're bringing it back. And the Educators Alliance Group, we will officially relaunch on October 2nd. That's next month at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This group will host a monthly gathering with updates and presentations from FAIR staff, fellows in education, chapter leaders, and occasional guest speakers. And our goal with this alliance is to equip K through 12 educators with the knowledge, strategies, and community support that they need to foster schools that are more enriching and free from bias and indoctrination for students and educators. So be sure to keep an eye out on our weekly newsletter for more details about the Educators Alliance. So with that, I bid you all good evening, happy Constitution Day, and we will see you at the next webinar.